All right, thanks everybody for showing up to the Applied Child Concentration meeting. We have an outstanding speaker and researcher that I've invited from Lehigh University to come and talk to us today. But I want to make an announcement first of all. Those of you who are second and third year students who declare the Applied Child Concentration, you need to apply to externships that are either school-based or have a school connected to them. So for example, a residential treatment center obviously has a school connected to it. You could apply to that. If you have any questions about that, please contact me. And so we can talk about it. I've, given students many handouts explaining this, but there's still some confusion. So if you have any questions, just email me directly, and I can try to explain it in more depth to you. But you do need to apply to a school-based externship or a clinic or a clinical setting that has a school attached to it. Okay? We have speaking with us today, Angeliki Nikolopoulou. How's that? She's not going to be talking about the Greek debt crisis. Although she might feel comfortable doing that. She's currently professor and chair in the psychology department at Lehigh University. She was born and raised in Patras, Greece, and came to the United States for her undergraduate and graduate education, receiving her PhD in psychology from the University of California at Berkeley in 1984. Since then, she's held research appointments at the City University of New York Graduate Center and the University of California, San Diego, in the Laboratory of Comparative Human Cognition, and has taught at UC San Diego, Smith College, and since 1996, Lehigh University. Dr. Nikolopoulou is a sociocultural developmental psychologist with a range of research interests that include the role of narrative in development, socialization, and education, the influence of the peer group and peer culture as social contexts for children's cognitive, socio-emotional, personality, and moral development, the relationship between play and narrative, the foundations of emergent literacy, and the developmental interplay between the construction of reality and the formation of identity, including gender identity. And I was first introduced to Angeliki's work through her paper on gender differences in character development. It's one of the most brilliant pieces of writing I've ever read. I strongly recommend everybody read that particular article. I knew after reading that I had to meet her, and so we scheduled a meeting, and I'm very happy I did that. One long-term line of research for Angeliki Nikolopoulou is a focus on children's narrative activities and their role in development. This research addresses both narrative development per se, the development of narrative competence and sophistication, and the role of narrative in the overall process of development, including cognitive, socio-emotional, and personality development. Much of this work has been based on studies of middle-income and low-income preschool classes in California, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, and I can now add Uganda, where a peer-oriented practice of spontaneous storytelling and story acting is a regular component of the curriculum. Relatedly, Dr. Nikolopoulou is also interested in constructing a standardized, developmentally appropriate, and culturally sensitive measurement instrument with which to comprehensively assess the narrative abilities of preschool children from disadvantaged and culturally diverse backgrounds. She has authored numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals and served as guest editor of a special issue of Cognitive Development in 2004 on the subject of play and narrative in the process of development, commonalities, differences, and interrelations. She's presented her research worldwide. She, not too long ago, just came back from a trip to Australia where she presented her work, and has been the recipient of numerous grants related to her work. One grant in particular was a huge NICHD grant, federal grant, 4 years long from 2004 to 2008, which was a narrative-based activity to promote school readiness. In addition to serving as chair in the psychology department at Lehigh, she supervises the Narrative Development Laboratory at Lehigh University. I consider Angeliki to be a colleague, a kindred spirit, a mentor of mine, and a friend. I just met her really back in April. I was reading through CVs of applicants to this year's class, and the student I was interviewing was from Lehigh, and she had mentioned that she had worked on theory of mind tasks in preschool settings and narrative development with Angeliki, and I instantly had to look her up and find her. And she was instrumental in really helping me develop the study that Valida and I did in Uganda back in August. So she's kind of a spiritual mentor of this whole project in establishing reading culture in Kitikesa, Uganda. So I want you all to give a hearty welcome to Angeliki Nikolopoulos.
That was a wonderful introduction. Can you guys hear me? No? Is this better? Yes or no?
I'll work on that.
Okay. Yes. So let me try to speak as loudly as I can. But thank you very much for inviting me and for this wonderful introduction. So I want to present today, as Jeff was mentioning, I have a long line of research looking at narrative activity, and I chose one specific aspect to present here. Can you guys hear me all the way back there?
Just barely.
Just barely. Is that better?
There's something wrong with the microphone.
Okay, so then, although it seems let's see if I can, okay. So, although the study that I have conducted is much larger, what I decided to do today is present, one aspect of it. And so the goals of the talk and what I want to try to accomplish today is to try to show that if we use socially meaningful narratives, we could actually are able to understand much more of the kids, and particularly their conceptions of the person. So what I'm interested in is using socially meaningful narratives, and that's what I want to focus on, how that will tell us about their conceptualizations of themselves. And to try to do that, what I'm going to do is try to look at an instructive kind of case, so that I will look at a discrepancy that exists in social cognition research and narrative research, and trying to actually see, there is a discrepancy exactly when kids understand mental characters as mental agents. So I want to try to actually argue that using socially meaningful narratives, we can actually understand that kind of gap a little bit. Okay. I want to say a few things. Although, an audience like this, you probably know a lot more about the conceptions of the person than even myself, being more a developmental, cognitive psychologist. But we all know that, really understanding the person and the conceptions we have, not only a sense of self, but actually how we conceptualize ourselves, is actually very important. We know that, for example, particularly the focus that I will use is social cognition, so that, when we know exactly if someone has a mental understanding, when we know that someone is doing something because of an intention or because of a particular kind of motive, then we know that, we can actually see their moral understanding. So the conceptualizations that we use of the self, that kids use of the self, and how they're conceptualizing with the self and others, give us a sense about moral development. I would say, whether we identify people as relational beings, again, what are the obligations we have to others is also important. Or with respect to stable identities, whether we see the identity as being continues in time and context again. Tells us something about moral commitment. We can see immediately that conceptualizations of the person has implications for different psychological processes. I focus much more on social cognition and moral understanding, but it would very well have implications for self-esteem, well-being, and so on. Okay? So just as a way to actually say why should we be interested in the conceptions of the person. So as I said, what I want to do is use an instructive case, looking between social cognition research and narrative research, and trying to understand why there is a problem in, when we're understanding conceptualizations of mental aging. So the question is, when do young children they represent characters as mental agents? And what I'm first looking at, we look at social cognition research. In this line of research, well, I want to remind you there was a long literature for a while that we were looking at the conceptions of the person, or what was called person perception, and we were asking kids open-ended descriptions of self and other. When we actually did, and that used to happen around the 70s, much more open-ended. Overall, this is the kind of trajectory that we saw. Around 6 to 7 years of age, kids would describe whether self or others in terms of just external physical characteristics. Okay, that's what, when we are asking them, who are you, or who is your friend, what they will give is much more actions and just external physical characteristics. It was not until 8 to 9 years, which is middle childhood, that the kids will actually begin to give more internal psychological characteristics, things like traits, stable personality, dispositions, and so on. And only by adolescence then, adolescents will be able to take these traits and dispositions and organize them much more in, an organized and integrated personality. So this is kind of when we're asking these open-ended interviews of self, that's what we seem to have gotten for several years. Then came what we all know about, social cognition research, but which is much more the theory of my research. Around the 1980s, we started actually using the false belief task to try to see would the kids understand others as mental agents, and as we all know, kids can pass that kind of task around 4 years of age. Does everyone know what I mean by the false belief task? Is someone who doesn't know? Should I explain it? Okay. But the false belief task, what we mean is, whether the idea is that you are able to attribute to someone that have mental characteristics, so they actually understand the world, but you can also understand that someone else might have a false belief. So the way we normally test the theory of mind task, let's say you place the chocolate in a particular kind in a cupboard, and then you take the character goes out, doesn't see someone else, change the chocolate and put it from the cupboard to the refrigerator. So we ask the child when this Katie, let's say, who went outside, did not see the chocolate be taken away, would she be able, where would she look? Would she look in the cupboard that was she placed it, or would you look at the refrigerator? And kids of 3 years of age, they actually tell us that the child will look at the refrigerator, the place that they themselves have seen it last, rather than being able to differentiate that there's another person who did not see where you took it away, cannot really tell. That will, they have a false belief. That's the idea here. So we know, there's a lot of literature here showing. Okay. So there's a lot of literature actually giving us, the theory of mind. So what we are, okay, I can begin to hear. So we actually actually see that around 2 years of age, young kids have what we call a desire psychology. The child is able to tell us about desires. They come to what we call theory of mind, which is desire belief psychology until around 4 years of age. The idea is with desire belief psychology, if I desire something, I know to get it based on my own beliefs. So there is integration of our desires and our beliefs. That's what we mean by theory of mind development. So we can actually see now, through this research is arguing that young kids then can tell someone is a mental agent when they're about 4 years of age. That's what the literature actually says. But remember what we said in terms of person perception research. It actually, we actually saw through their description that doesn't happen until middle child. Okay, so we kind of have a discrepancy here, that even within the social cognition research. Now if we turn to narrative research and ask, okay, when do kids represent characters as mental agents? And, we actually, again, get an interesting picture. By that, the way it has been tested usually is you are actually having a child tell a story to an experimenter. You are showing them whether you are showing them a picture book, like, let's say, the frog story, or any kind of other story. You are asking the child, tell me a story that the pictures made, and then we're looking the way they are actually telling us about the characters, whether they're contributing to their internal states, motivations, and what the literature says that doesn't happen until 8 to 9 years of age. So just presenting them a narrative, that's or even, a number of them. And there's a number of people, so even Nancy Stein actually argues that young children do not use narrative to explore internal state, motivation, and thinking of their story characters. So we can begin to see then there is a discrepancy with the narrative research and theory of mind, in one case saying, and also the personal perception research, saying that young kids cannot really tell us about the internal states of characters and represent characters as mental agents until they are middle childhood, while theory of mind doesn't happen so much earlier. So now people have noticed, and I was not the only one, noticing this discrepancy. A number of people had tried to notice it, and the way they try to explain, saying, well, really what happens, although kids know a lot about social cognition, because of the storytelling and the dimension that storytelling has on the child, they are not really representing the characters as mental agents. So it will take a while because the child needs to learn how to tell a good story in order to actually be able to integrate their own ideas of social cognition. That's why we actually have such a discrepancy. But I would argue really that discrepancy is pretty big. From 4 years to 7, 8, this kind of seems, that doesn't seem to me to be exactly what's going on. And other people even try to minimize it, and actually there was an interesting study done by Benson. She actually had kids tell stories, and now she looked at all the every type of mental conception that could be provided. For example, sensations. If the child said, that the character was hungry, if they saw something, they look at something, if they said that they had wants, emotions, and she argued, because that's all she was able to actually find, that early on they are precursors, to full mental conceptions, and that's what we get with narratives. I would argue that I think the problem is the way the narratives were really, how the narratives were really, the stories were really elicited. I would say it's much more of the problem, because what we have a child just telling a story. Even if we have 5 stories, we are telling it to an experimenter. I think that narrative actually has an audience. We're actually using a narrative or something. At that moment, we might not really tap it much more what kids are doing. That's why, in a way, what I would argue is that we have not really looked at narratives that are socially constructed, that they have some meaning, that they are used for some purpose. Because, you know, when we all tell stories, we say it for some reason. You know, we don't, you know, we come to someone and say, you know what happens to me, this is what happened, or, you know, that kind of, always you have to think of, you know, that there is an audience. So what we try to do is, of course, you know, through a longer study that we were doing to actually elicit narratives in much more social context, which I'll explain a little bit more. And also, I would say what we need is a conceptualization of the person, much more, not the whole elements of sensation, perceptions. All those elements are important, but how can we construct it? How can we actually see a typology of person? Okay. So I want to talk first about what would it mean to elicit narrative blends in social context, and here I will talk of the storytelling, story acting activity that I have used for several years and what that activity really entails. This was originated from a preschool teacher. She worked in the Chicago Laboratory School, and she had this activity that she was using with the young kids. There would be a storytelling phase. The child can come and tell any story they want to the teacher. The teacher will sit down and write down the story as the child told it. Okay? The kid was not really given some kind of theme that they would give. The story would be any story that the child wants to tell. That's the story telling phase. This normally happens during free play while the kids, there are other activities that the kids could be doing. One of the activities would be to go to the teacher who has the storybook and write down the story as the child says. Then later on the day, there is the phase which is the story acting phase. So after, let's say, free play has ended and all the other activities that they do, they will come together as a large group. And at that moment, the child then who has told the story that day, they will come at the stage. I will show you a little video so you can actually see, you know, some of these ideas I'm talking about. So the child will come next to the teacher will read the story that the child told. Now and then the child afterwards will choose his or her friend to act out the story. Then the teacher will read the story once again, and then the kids, the author together with the kids would act out the story. Okay? So let's hope that the video works. What I'm going to show you is the storytelling activity that I have actually done in several preschool classrooms. This happens to be a low-income preschool classroom in Philadelphia. And what you are going to see is the taking down of the stories and then the stage that has been constructed for the kid. And then I will also show you another video where you see again just the taking down of the story very briefly, and then you'll see the acting out of the story. So let's hope it works.
Some children wrote their stories in their journals. And some children wrote stories with Miss Liz in storybooks. Give me a story.
So what you saw in this video is actually the stage, which happens during the large group time. The teacher is telling us how the story were actually taken, and then it went back to actually show what happened earlier that they are taking down the story. So now I will show you the actual reading of a story. And the acting out.
A girl named Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, and Cinderella. And the king said they can't go anywhere because their shoes are wearing out. Then Cinderella and me went to our friend's house, Jordan, Ranea, and Kiara, Wanye, and Zaire, the end. Sleeping Beauty. Okay. Can we imagine Snow White and Cinderella? Okay, you're Sleeping Beauty, you're Cinderella.
Snow White.
Okay, right now you can be Snow White, come on. And we need a king. Brandon, you're the king. We need your friends. Okay, you're one yet. Here we are. Once upon a time, there was a girl named Sleeping Beauty. Snow. And the king said they can't go anywhere because their shoes are wearing out. Then Cinderella and me went to our friend's house. Go on, friends, you can be over there. Jordan, Ranea, Kiara, Wanye, and Zaire. The end. Great story. Great story.
Okay, this should give you an idea. I didn't use that I meant to use another video that will give you a better idea of the acting out the story, but what I want to mention is why the storytelling, story acting activity, what makes it special. In a way, it really is a very simple activity, but it actually has powerful and complex effects. As Jeff was mentioning, I have used this storytelling, story acting activity to try to see whether they promote school readiness. We actually have been able to show that. But what I want to point out to some aspects that maybe, in a way it looks like it's kind of chaotic because the kids are coming up trying to actually act the story. I want to point out some of the things about it. In a way, the activity happens every day in the classroom they were looking at, and the kids, about 3 or 4 kids, will come out and tell a story every day. So that means as it's going through and as it gets established, kids tend to have 3 different roles. They can be tellers, telling their story. They can be actors, acting the stories, whether in their own story or in the story of other kids, and they are also the audience very often. And what also needs to happen with young kids, in fact, they have to learn to be the audience. Young kids very often want to act out in the story, and they don't exactly recognize the difference between, okay, if you want to tell a story, you must do it earlier in the day, and not the moment when the teacher is actually reading the story, they recognize it. You have to act out my story, and you tell them, you didn't tell us a story, because you didn't want to tell a story. So there's a number of things that the kids are learning. It's actually a much more integrated kind of activity. The other thing that is quite interesting is that the kids are telling stories. Very often we know that kids are listening to stories. Parents read to them books, but very rarely we ask them to tell their own story. I mean, if we know anything about reading and writing that we do in college classrooms, the two need to come together. We don't only, if you're actually reading something, you also need to tell about it. So this is an activity that actually taps into the telling of the story, which kids love to do, by the way. Sometimes the teachers feel doesn't have enough time, and the kid, we say, well, we're not going to do storytelling today. The kids will actually bring her the book and say, no, Miss Judy, we can't do that. You have to actually take the stories down. So they actually are very interested in that. But what makes it unique, I would say, is this acting out of the stories, which kids actually have to learn how to do away, particularly in the low-income classrooms that I have worked with. The acting out, as you can see, what brings out the actually combines play and narrative, where the child actually told a story to a teacher. That story, because, and that's what makes stories difficult, is what we can call a decontextualized language. You are actually using words to represent a whole picture of the world. When now we're taking that story and acting it out, the story becomes contextualized, that the child is actually understanding it in a very different way as they are acting it out with each other. So what makes this activity powerful is exactly this coordination and the alternation between the contextualized and decontextualized language over and over again every day, or the play and narrative. On the other hand, what we have, and it wasn't, I have some other videos that shows you very well, it's definitely a performative activity. They are acting it out, and very often by the end of the year, they know how to do it well, and they really, if you don't act out their story, they're very upset. You have to act out the story. It's a performative activity, but also what happens, it happens in the peer group context. So you saw that the child who told the story is given first, is asked what role do they want to play, so they have first pick of their role, and then they are the ones who pick the other roles of the other kids. And very often you'll see them looking around, thinking, okay, I want you to play. Or they will actually tell you as they're playing with other kids, you often hear them, they say, if you don't play with me today, you are not going to be in my story. Okay, so you actually have this group dynamics and affiliation, and or if they play together, then they put them in their story. So it's kind of, you actually see, is part of the peer group culture that the kids are actually using. Because of that, it motivates the children to participate in the activity. It's actually structured. They don't have to tell a particular kind of story. They can tell a story as far as it can go. It allows them to enter into the activity in their own, whatever their own proclivities and abilities are. And they're supported by other children. So that's what I would say makes it a socially meaningful activity. So they tell stories to each other. Although the teacher is the one who takes it down, the stories are really directed to someone else. And that's why when we're doing the activity and all the teachers, you don't really tell the kids, no, this is an appropriate story, this is not an appropriate story. You're allowing the kids to actually say the story any way they want, and also even grammatical errors or things like that, we don't actually correct them. This is another place to do that in the classroom, but not in this activity. This really allows the kids to tell what they have in their own mind and allow them to build around, and we actually see the whole formation of a peer group culture through this activity. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is there are a number, we selected stories then through this activity in order to be able to look now at the development of mental agents. What we're trying to do, classrooms don't have 30 kids, as you probably know, but also they don't have kids that are 3s, 4s, and 5-year-olds. They're all mixed. So it took us about, I think I've done this activity with about 5 classrooms, where then I could pick kids, randomly selected 3s, 3-year-olds that were 10 3-year-olds, 5 boys and 5 girls, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, so I would have 30 kids. And these were middle class preschools I was looking at that time. And out of those, we have 670 stories through this activity that I presented. That means that the stories range. Some kids, because the children tell stories throughout the year, some of them have up to 9 stories per child, others have up to 44 stories. Actually had a child who even had more stories like that. And they were all in this kind of voluntary, self-initiated, the shared public setting that you saw, and it's part of their everyday group life. So now taking those stories, what I did is develop, with one of my graduate students, we developed a typology of, as I was saying before, we need to have some ideas exactly what does it mean for a person to actually develop, their conceptualization develop. This was not really available in anywhere in psychological research. So what the first people I have there, so I actually looked into philosophy. Amelia Rorty and several philosophers who talk of intentionality, what would it mean to talk of mental agent. Also narratologists who look a lot about the characters and how they're represented in texts and different novels and so on, and also psychological research. Taking all those ideas together, I came up with what I've called that the typology will come from actors. The first level would be that we're thinking, well, how can we represent characters? Would be actors, agents, to persons. And I will explain a little bit more what I mean by that, and then I will give you some examples so you can actually see these ideas. Okay, the first level is what I will call actors, which means that the child will represent the story just simply through actions, and they might give some characteristics, some external characteristics and some descriptions. But what we're really talking about, the child is representing things through actions. The second level, the key together is what would be basic psychological capacities. Let me put all of it together so you can see. So here the agents, we're talking in terms of intentionality or simple consciousness, but nothing more is like I would say that we're talking about basic psychological capacities. That's what the picture, that comes also from the typology of Brunner, who talks about narrative, that we start from the landscape of action and we go to the landscape of consciousness. And he argues that the two come together. At this moment, I have them the two separate, okay? So you have the landscape of action, so intentions in action. As I said, when I give you some examples, you realize, and the other is just simple consciousness. And the third level is more what theory of mind research will argue, that not only we have desires, intentions, or beliefs, but we use them, and they are coordinated with action. So it's not enough to say that someone has a thought. The thought must actually lead to some action, and or we can contrast with the representation. Let me give you some examples. They're easier to understand. So this is a story, and I will normally show you a story from a boy or a girl. Once there was Peter Pan, and then a night came, and Captain Hook. He fight it, and the night and the Peter Pan fight it. Catwoman and Joker fight it too. Okay? Simple actions. Okay? Nothing else here. Here in this one, we'll get some descriptions. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful little princess. So what I'm underlining is what actually makes it to that category. Then a prince came, the princess grew up and they married, and they had two babies, a boy and a girl. Another prince came and married the other girl. They had a puppy and a little cat. So again, actions with some external characteristics or possessions that the child might have. Okay, now we look at the landscape of action or intention in action. First there was Leonardo, and then Donatello came to help Leonardo fight. And then Raphael came, and Michelangelo came to help Donatello fight. And then Shredder came, and then Captain America fought, and then Super N came. And then Super N helped Donatello to fight using his powers. And then the rest. And then Shredder and Super N are the only ones there, and they fight. And then that's the end. Okay. In case you're wondering, I'm using always a pseudonym for the child at the end. And the 4-4 means that the child is 4 years, 4 months. Okay, that's what that stands for. So you can see here you have only intentions in actions. He came to help someone. That's as much as the basic psychological characteristics are here. Okay, let's look at simple consciousness. Once upon a time there was a little girl. There was a kingdom. It had a princess, a queen, a king. They had one baby, and then the wolf came and ate the baby, and the queen was very sad. Okay? So now you can see there is a reaction, there's an emotion to it. But it's, again, a simple psychology. Something happened and you actually are reacting to that. Give you another one to give you a sense. You know, the ghost scared the alligator, and the alligator scared the ghost, and then they had a fight. The alligator fought, and he won. The alligator chopped him up, and he was still alive. They were just friends. I wanted to show you that also boys will give us some simple consciousness. Yes? Okay. The next one I'm now going to what we'll call the conceptions of the person, and you'll actually see that it will be a lot more underlined in the story, and you see they're quite complex. Once upon a time there was a kingdom. There was a king and a queen and a princess. One time they all went walking in the woods and they get lost. There was a witch in their house. When they came home they said, "My, everything looks different." And the witch jumped out and said, "Surprise!" One time when the little girl was sleeping, the witch came into her room and scared her. And she waked up, and the witch ran away, and the girl said, "Oh, there is nothing here." And the witch came back and knocked on her door, and there was no one there, and she said, "Oh, there is no one knocking on my door either." Later, when she woke up, she was terribly cranky because she didn't have enough sleep. When her parents saw her being so cranky in her room, she couldn't go to school, and this was her favorite day. She said, "Mom, it's not really my fault. A witch came into my room." But her mom didn't believe in witches. You can see here that the child is contrasting her own beliefs with that of her mother, the reality with what happens outside. There is someone here, there is no someone here. That's why I call that contrasted representation, the representation of the self and others. And one more story with a contrastedness. Once there was Robin Hood, then a bear came, but the bear was nice, and Robin Hood thought the bear was evil, so he shot an arrow at the bear, but the bear knocked the arrow out of the way. The bear did fight Robin Hood, so he shot another arrow at the bear, but the bear again knocked the arrow out of the way. After that, the bear didn't run at Robin Hood. Bear was a nice bear, so then I told Robin Hood that the bear was a nice bear. So they were friends, and then a bad guy came. The bear and Robin Hood fighted the bad guy, and the bad guy died, and Robin Hood and the bear won the fight. Okay? Again, you can actually see he's evil, he's not, how he actually understands that he's actually good, they become friends, and so on. This is what I would call in these two last stories that are much more complex. That's what I call they have a conception of a person in terms of a mental age, which is quite more complicated, of course, than say that a child give us, just a mental state word, like, has a belief or, without really coordinating. So what you can see is that the criteria are quite demanding. Okay? So we applied this typology to all 600 stories, 617 that we had, and now I'm going to show you the results. This now takes all the stories that the child said and put them in a different category. What proportion of the kids' stories fell into the different categories, then per different age groups who actually get mid-proportions. So the arrows, I know it's hard for you to see, but the crossed lines, those are the actors. The middle level is the ages, and the top, the darker one, is the persons. So you can see that there's a predominance for threes to talk more about actors. We have more around 4, which is agents, and we have more at 5 that they are persons. And this is only the girl stories. Okay, so we can see this, what happens. The boy stories kind of follow a similar trajectory, but they are slower in their development to persons. They actually remain more at the action level, so even 5-year-olds give us some actors, and they give fewer person kind of categories. I will go, I also have a slide which shows from fall to spring what happened. I will go quickly through this. This is a girl story. You see the same pattern. So, and the same thing, fall to spring, there's a development. So that as the kids are telling stories, you actually can see the developmental progression from fall to spring. Here I'm actually trying to show this picture a little bit more condensed in a way. So the reds are the girls, the blues are the boys. And here I'm looking at the main character representation that a child got. So you are giving all their stories a level. Each level we can actually see actors. If there was the actor 1, we give them a 0.1, L2 because this is a progression. So we can actually see exactly what would be the main characters. When we put all their stories together, we can again see the girls are actually, again, are always above the boys, so the trend towards the higher characters are, it's faster for the girls. So there's, as you can see, an effect of age and semester and a trend towards gender. The next one looks at the beginning stories and at the end, and again the same kind of trend. So here is me representation, the earlier stories and the later stories, so beginning threes, end of threes, and we can see the same kind of trajectory.
Good, 10 minutes.
So quickly I'm going to show you in the, if we look at agents, now I'm looking just at the agents, particularly, what I want to point out is these are the total percentage of agents, and here we're looking at how many of them fall into the narrative landscape of action and consciousness. You should actually see that boys are higher in actions, while girls are higher in consciousness. This doesn't mean that, the percentages are different. That's why I've highlighted the 48%. That's exactly the same thing. So you can actually see, the picture still holds. Boys tend to favor much more the action, the intention in action, as Donatello came to fight, versus while the landscape of consciousness tends to be favored more by the girls. Same picture if we look at representation, even, overall I would say, we can actually see that the girls are the ones who come to person earlier than the boys. Okay. So very quickly, let me summarize my results, which are simple, it's a way we saw this increase from actors to characters to person, increased over the course of the year, from fall to spring. But we saw that girls seem to have a higher trajectory of development than the boys. So let me conclude then with few conclusions and implications while the research is trying to argue. We see then, if we go back to the age discrepancy that we had between persons as mental agents, whether we look at person perception research or the narrative research, I was able to actually reduce it to about 1 year. By 5 years of age, they were actually able to represent quite complex persons, okay? And I was saying the reason that's the case, we use a kind of a sophisticated typology. The criteria were very stringent in a way, I would say, but the narratives were in social context. I mean, the kids actually told stories to each other, and what I found quite interesting in those stories, even when I would listen to theory of mind research, I was fascinated that kids actually use theory of mind in their own stories, which actually indicates that theory of mind is something that they are really interested in. They are trying to figure out the world around them. So I think if we have stories that are part of a more socially meaningful for each other, I think we can get a better sense of what the capabilities are, of what conceptions of the person. Not only, in this research, I only focus between 3 to 5 year olds, but I would say this can apply to other ages as well. For example, middle childhood and adolescence. So I've only used this as an instructive example. because I don't think it's the only way, just for the young kids and the conceptions of the person. As I said earlier, I do think the narrative can become a vehicle by which we are trying to understand what kids are actually saying. It's a way, if we ask the child, tell me who you are, they need to be articulate about themselves. But when we are asking them to tell a story, and they tell a story in social context to one another, we can actually see much more the capabilities.
So we'll take questions now. There's questions.
So it seems like this project was really as like to develop like a theory for child development in terms of like theory of mind and other things. But have you thought about using the story acting or storytelling capacity as like intervention? Like I'd be curious to see a control group who doesn't get this task over the course of the year if they would develop differently.
Yeah, we have actually, in fact, we have actually done a study like that. One of my graduate students has tried to do a study. And I mean, the problem in trying, and I have used this much more, I have used these activities and intervention, as I said before, to promote school readiness. And by that I mean, that we can look at the development of oral language, literacy, and social competence, because they are actually self-regulating themselves with the activity, and I've actually shown that that's the case. And that was done with 7 experimental and 7 controlled classrooms. That was the study I had from NICSD. So I have used it. In fact, this is one slice of the work. In some ways the smallest one, while the bigger one is using it as an intervention and trying to show the effects that you're talking about here. Yes?
Do you attribute girls' more rapid acquisition of higher level characters than boys to the content, of stories that are told in bring like structural differences, or a combination of the two, or better?
Now that's an interesting question. I'm not so sure I know exactly, but I will say what's interesting is, they have different preferences. My view of how gender develops, because their stories have become very gendered, and I have actually studied the development of gender identity in this classroom, and they use them in order to promote their sense of, gender identity. My sense is that, it's not only, I favor Markovy's theory, which actually says that there might be some small differences that we start with, and then as we are actually understanding and pulling different things from our environment, they can get exaggerated. What was interesting is that, if you look at consciousness, for example, and that's why I had one example that boys can also tell a story, their sense of also of how they will do the contrastiness is very different. It's much more about cognitions, not so much about emotions, desires. So there's a different sense. I think we know that they orient themselves more towards girls towards relational, and boys more agentive. I think there is something there. But I would say that what the kids are trying to do are trying to figure out who they are. I don't see that because they tell gender stories, that will be the end of the world. In some ways, I think that they are trying to figure out who they are. Gender is one of the major categories that we use in our society, and they are actually trying to figure it out. So I think by allowing them to do that, they can actually. So I don't think that's the end of it.
Do the teachers ever try to push the children through the different stages? So, like, if a child is acting out a story and there's a lot of action going on, but there's not very much description of emotions, would the teacher ever ask, like, oh, well, how does this character feel now that they got kicked or something, just to try to get the child to verbalize that and to move through the different stages?
Because what we are trying to do, I think one could take, let's say, an activity like that and trying to promote, different levels. The teachers don't do that, nor do they really understand what the kids are exactly doing until I would go back and give them the whole analysis, let's say. We also tell them not to do that, because what we are trying to do is allow the kids to have their own voice. I have seen very often, I mean, teachers realize quickly that the kids tell gender stories. You know, girls tell stories about family much more often, boys tell stories about action, characters, and so on. And, you know, what I've seen is that teachers who might try to change the kids, what they achieve is for the child to become silent and not tell stories. Okay? So in some ways, I think you have to allow the kids their own flexibility. That's why, also if you notice, even one of the 5-year-olds, they make all sorts of grammatical errors, and, you know, the teacher will not. In this activity, I think allow them to have their own voice. If you come and ask them to do things, they don't, this is not their activity any longer. Someone is trying to save it. But I could, you know, one could use it and then see, I'm not so, you know, that one could actually how does the character feel, and, you know, kids would get. They get that a little bit as they are acting the stories. I mean, what the other kids tell them, let's say they like to have a lot of characters, and they give them very little action, and then one of the kids come back and say, but you didn't give me any lines, you know, my story. So the kids themselves are motivating them to push them further. So that's how the motivation comes from the peer group. Yes?
Because the essential is students as actors, but they're forced on telling stories in other areas so that they essentially like lying.
I didn't hear the last word.
Like lying, they get a lot of attention as actors telling a story. And then they bring that into telling stories about other things that turn into lying.
We didn't get any, you know, lying or those, none of the stories were like that. But they are really interested in the symbolic elements that you can tell of their stories. It is true that the activity promotes a performative element, you know, a dramatic kind, and they do realize that. And very often, early on, they realize that the best thing you could do is tell a story that has a lot of characters and bring everyone on stage. Okay? So in some ways, you have to be able to structure it without curtailing it. So I had one teacher who, she was a young teacher, it was her first year, she was overwhelmed at some point, the kids are telling this very long story, and she says, no, you can have only 5 characters. If you reach 5 characters, you can't tell a story after that. Well, nothing happened. I mean, in a way, the kids don't have even a conception what 5 characters are, and how would you do that, yeah. But, you know, what's interesting, they don't see that, okay, this is a story means some line. It's kind of, they're really trying to work their social work, I think. Yes?
I noticed like the gender differences at the end of 3 years was shrinking. Your chart and the other year beginning in the 4 and the 5 and still you see. I'm not sure whether that's significant differences. But do you have any explanation to the differences shrinking at the end of the 3rd year?
In some ways, I mean, you know, the numbers are not huge how many kids I have there. I only have 5 boys and 5 girls per age group. Because, you know, there are a lot of stories that they told. We've been analyzing 600 stories, but still the numbers are not huge. So I would not take, you know, I mean, it could be very idiosyncratic. The gender effect through the character representation, it was at one moment becomes 0.06, that was significant, so there's a trend, and other times it's not. It varies. If I look, which I didn't show here, if I look at the highest level of the kids tell, I don't have gender differences. So now I take only the stories at the highest level that the kids have. 2 stories to be generative. So for example, you know, if child gave me 1 story at level 5, but gave me 2 stories at level 4, I will say that their level is 4. Then I don't see gender differences, okay? But when I look at the development of the whole classroom, you actually get, you know, by the end of the year, their stories have become more gender. I've looked at it by looking at the formation of the common culture. The threes don't really fully understand what's going on yet, okay? You know, and it comes around 4 that they are understanding and using gender, using their stories. And I think that's what you might see, but the threes might not be as
I wonder whether family structure might moderate some of the gender outcomes that you observe. I know you had a small sample and it might be difficult to look at moderators, but I just wonder whether that might have some impact. Like watching a female-headed household, you know, your mother without a father around, being agentic, or a dual wagering family in which both parents are working and showing agency, as opposed to one being, you know, stratified into a particular kind of division of labor. I wonder if you could comment on that.
The gender differences I saw first in the Berkeley's child care group, and I was surprised. Okay, the teachers have not noticed it because they were so much about having the kids being egalitarian and be ungendered, and they were not really noticing. Most of the kids were coming from families where their parent was professor at Berkeley, and it was the mom who had the most important work. She was an attorney in the city. Okay? So you actually had these, and that's why nobody was noticing the gender differences. So I don't think it has to do at that moment with family life. I do believe that the kids bring into the classroom those kind of, you know, what is from home, but the peer group also is what also was promoting. That's what I said before. For me, what the kids are trying to do is figuring out what is this big category that we're using, which is gender, and what does it mean? And I think they become more gendered at that moment in trying. And, you know, you could have input from their home, and their play could be different, but their stories were more gendered. And, you know, gender is also socio-relational, it's a public arena, so the stories could be becoming more gender because of that. But I expect that later on, if I follow these kids later on, I don't expect it to necessarily be a gender.
Any other questions? Going once, twice? Well, I want to thank you, Angeliki, for a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Should I hit the record button to stop it? Would that stop it?
Press the red again?
Yeah.